Fabulous. Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, everyone. My name's Tim Hazel, and I'm here to talk to you today about Elmbridge's early history. It's a little research project that I've been working on for the last few months, and I'm excited to share it all with you here today. Now, the aim of this talk is to walk through some of the big historical events that took place here in Elmbridge between the years 55 BCE and 1066, to have a look at how life changed for the people who lived here, how it stayed the same, and answer some big questions about local history, like did Julius Caesar fight a big battle here in Walton-on-Thames, as some people claim? Did the Vikings ever raid this far inland? And what was life like for the regular people? And of course, how it lay the foundations of the Elmbridge that we know today. So I'm going to begin in the year 55 BCE, the year that written words came to Britain. What do I mean by that? Well, people have lived here in Britain and in Elmbridge for about 800,000 years. But for most of that history, as far as we know, they had no written language. They were an illiterate society. That all changed in 55 BCE when the written word made its way to Britain. Great news for us historians. The written word is excellent for providing colour and detail to our picture of history. Terrible news for the people who lived here at the time, because the written word did not make its way to Britain peacefully. It came at the head of an invading army led by a man with a strong jaw and a big forehead, a man called Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar invaded Britain in the years 55 and 54 BCE with his Roman army. He fought his way up to the River Thames from the south coast, and there, according to his own writings, he met the British chieftain Cassivelaunus in a great climactic battle. A battle that some people claim took place just down the road that way, about 10 minutes a bit past Walton Bridge near Oatlands. We'll get more into that claim a little bit later. But first, we have to ask ourselves the question, what was Julius Caesar even doing here in our little corner of England in the first place? Now, Julius Caesar is a very famous historical figure. I would bet that everyone in this room has heard of him. Just quickly, has anyone not heard of Julius Caesar? Excellent. We're all on the same page? Good. Julius Caesar is very famous. Almost everyone's heard of him, and there's a good reason for that. Julius Caesar made sure that everybody had heard about Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a Roman, but he was not the emperor of Rome. He was not the king of Rome. He was not a tyrant or dictator. Not yet, at least. He was a politician in the Roman Republic. That's how the Romans governed themselves. Rome and its empire was governed by elected officials, of which Caesar was just one. And like any good politician, and he was a very good politician, he was always thinking about the next election. He was always thinking about opinion polls and his very carefully crafted public image. And the image that he had created for himself was as a soldier, as a warrior and a conqueror, the kind of guy that took armies far afield to defeat barbarians, expand Rome's empire, and make everyone nice and rich by taking the possessions and land of the people he conquered and selling them into slavery. Nowadays, we'd probably consider him a bit of a problematic leader for these reasons, but the Romans were into it. That was exactly how they pictured their perfect leader. They were a martial, warlike people who respected military conquest. Caesar had already done very well with the electorate by conquering Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium. So when it came to Britain, if you asked Caesar, and he gives his justification, he says he had a good strategic reason for coming here. The people of Britain were providing refuge to enemies of Rome. They were providing aid to rebels on the continent. That could well be the case. But if you ask me, I think Julius Caesar came to Britain for the same reason that the Americans landed a man on the moon in the 1960s, to prove that he could. Britain was, to the Romans, a distant, misty isle, essentially the edge of the world. No Roman general had ever set foot there before with an army. Very few Romans had. So to Caesar, this was a great PR stunt. This was a great publicity boon to have invaded Britain. That being said, and it was a great PR stunt, people were very impressed, it achieved very little. In the first time Caesar came to Britain, in 55 BCE, he turned up on a beach, he had a scrap with the locals, he got rained on, and he went home, having achieved absolutely nothing. The next year, he came back and he took it a bit more seriously. He came back with 3 times as many men, anywhere between 30 and 40,000 legionaries, and an armada of 800 ships that he'd built over a single winter. And this scared the locals, because according to Caesar, the local Brittonic Celts planned to fight him on the beaches and see if they could drive him into the sea. But when his enormous armada appeared on the horizon, they quickly thought better of that and retreated inland. So Julius Caesar landed on the south coast of England for the second time and started making his way towards the River Thames. And it was at the Thames that the locals, the natives, decided to turn round and try and stop him. A Brittonic chief called Cassivellaunus, who ruled a people living north of the Thames, set up defensive fortifications, according to Caesar's own account. He sharpened wooden stakes and put them on the north bank of the Thames to prevent Caesar's horsemen from swimming quickly across the river and attacking his warriors. This is a very sound strategy. Horses, being intelligent animals, don't gallop onto sharpened sticks. But it didn't matter, because Caesar was brilliant and got everything right, according to his own account, and he won regardless. Now, some claim that this battle took place in Walton-on-Thames. Why is that the case? What makes people think that? Well, it's all got to do with those sharpened stakes that I've underlined. In the late 16th century, an Elizabethan historian called William Camden, a very well-respected man, claimed with great confidence that he had identified this town, Walton-on-Thames, as the site of this famous battle. And his reasoning is that he had been here and he had seen at Cowie Sales, just beyond Walton Bridge, these wooden stakes. He saw these sharpened stakes and he put 2 and 2 together and decided that this was the site of Caesar's battle. And because he was a well-respected and intelligent man, lots of people believed him, including his fellow writer, John Milton, who you might know as the author of Paradise Lost, a great epic poem in the English language. John Milton agreed. He thought that this was definitely the spot, and he even cites the Anglo-Saxon writer Bede. Bede was an 8th century writer who describes seeing the stakes in his day. He says that they were still visible. And he said that they were roughly the thickness of a man's thigh. This became a relevant comment in the year 1807, when a fisherman from Shepperton dragged some of these stakes out of the river, and he described word for word that they were the thickness of a man's thigh. So there we have it. That's how the story began, that Walton-on-Thames was the site of this battle. So let's us do some investigating. Let's do some history. You will act as my jury. I will present for you the evidence for and some alternative viewpoints. And I'll let you guys decide whether or not this theory holds any weight. To start with, we've got the description of those stakes. Caesar talks about sharpened stakes. Bede talks about sharpened stakes. Lo and behold, in the Elizabethan era, sharpened stakes are found in Walton-on-Thames. There's also the location. So one of the things that made this William Camden fella absolutely convinced that he had correctly identified the site of this battle was that Walton-on-Thames lies roughly 80 Roman miles from the sea, from where he thought Caesar landed. This is what Caesar says in his own writings. He says, I marched 80 miles from where I disembarked to the Thames, where I fought this battle. Now, a Roman mile is a bit shorter than a modern mile, so in modern speak, that's about 73 miles. And this works quite well, but it's not really watertight reasoning, because using the same logic, other people, like Montague Sharp, a 20th century historian, argued that places like Brentford were in fact the site of the battle. Because it turns out we don't know where Caesar landed, and quite a lot of the south coast of England is roughly 75 miles from various points on the Thames. The Thames is a big river, and the south coast of England is long and wide, so any of these places could in fact be the place. We also can't be sure that the stakes that William Camden found were in fact defensive fortifications. He was convinced. But in 1768, a London lawyer called Daines Barrington, who was a huge buff for this kind of stuff, came to Walton to have a look for himself and chat with the locals, and he concluded that the stakes were actually part of an old fishing weir, a much more boring explanation. Montague Sharp, that far more serious historian from the early 20th century who thought Brentford was the place, also came and had a look, and he concluded that they were a cattle fence. He pointed to the fact that that part of Walton is called Cowie Sales. Cowie comes from the Old English cow way, the way you take your cows. These were cattle fields. He said it makes sense that they would have wooden fences to stop the cows from escaping. And of course, this reminds us that we need to be moderate in our guessing. As exciting as it is to find a wooden stake in the river and imagine it playing part of a great climactic battle that forever decided Britain's destiny and history, there are lots of reasons people put wood in rivers. We build bridges, we build pontoons, we build fences, we build tide markers. It could be any one of these. So, that's really all we've got. We've got no contemporary account from the time outside of Caesar's very lacking in detail one that might give us some clues. Is anyone convinced? Does anyone reckon that Walton-on-Thames was definitely the place of this battle? Have we got some no's? We've got a yes? One over there, fantastic. Does anyone have absolutely no idea and think this is a fruitless task because we will never ever come to any solid, reasonable conclusion? Anybody? Fantastic, good to see we're all on the same page. It didn't matter anyway, because even though Caesar was very successful in his second invasion, it still achieved absolutely nothing for the Romans. He left, and the Romans for the next 97 years had wanted nothing to do with Britannia. He left in 55 BCE, it would be 43 CE when the Romans came back. In that time, a couple of things changed. So like I said, the written word had come with the Romans, and the Britons clearly took this in their stride because they started minting coins with names on them. This is a first in British history. People had lived here for hundreds of thousands of years. Undoubtedly, they had rulers. We don't know any of those rulers' names because they never wrote them down. It was in the late 1st century BCE they started putting the names of their kings, the names of their rulers on their coins. And predictably, it happened in the south of England, around the southeast, around the Thames, the place that had the closest contact with the neighboring Roman Empire. Now, the Romans would come back in 43 CE with a vengeance. But to understand why they did that, we have to understand what happened in Rome in the meantime. So about 10 years after Julius Caesar won his battle on the Thames, that may or may not have happened 10 minutes that way, he was quite famously murdered. And after his murder, the republican system that the Romans had governed themselves with for nearly 500 years collapsed, and the empire fell into the hands of military dictators, military strongmen. Now, they still called themselves a republic. They would for another 300 years. But they were a republic in the same way that the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea is a republic. It wasn't. It was clearly a military dictatorship, and everyone knew that. These military dictators were called emperors. That comes from the Latin word imperator, meaning a general, a military leader. And it was the fourth of these dictators who would set his sights on Britain, a man named Claudius. That's Derek Jacobi to our Claudius fans. And Claudius was terribly insecure. Claudius had never proven himself in battle. He had never won a victory. He had never conquered anywhere. And this was a problem for a Roman emperor, because as I said before, the Romans respected martial valor. They respected conquest. They looked to leaders who could lead them in battle. All of his predecessors had been great conquerors. The first emperor had conquered Egypt. The second emperor, very unpopular man called Tiberius, but no one could deny that he was a good general. The third emperor, his immediate predecessor, Caligula, wasn't, but his dad was, and that counted for something. Besides, Caligula was murdered, so Claudius wasn't going to base himself on him. So Claudius was looking for an easy victory to shut all of his critics up about the fact that he couldn't conquer anywhere. But he also needed to conquer somewhere significant enough that he could justify making a big deal out of it. And that's why he set his sights on Britannia. In 43 CE, 2 years after he took power, he sent his legions to Britain. And the locals put up a fight, and the fight was fierce, but it was one-sided. The Romans came with overwhelming manpower and resources. They even bought war elephants all the way from Africa. Not to use in battle, just to show off, because nothing says, I'm the new boss, like riding in on an elephant. And so we enter the era of Roman Elmbridge. Now, the ways that the Romans would affect Britannia and Elbridge, there's lots of them, but one of the most obvious ways is in their architecture. The Romans were great builders. You might say that they won their empire as much with a spade and hammer as much as they did with a sword and shield. They built roads, they built cities, they built towns, and there's a great anecdote to show this. The leader of the British resistance, when the Romans invaded, was a man called Caratacus. He was a British war chieftain. And Caratacus fought bravely, but he lost. And he soon realized that the fight for Britain was over. He would have to flee into exile. But he was betrayed by his own allies and handed over to the Romans. The Emperor Claudius was ecstatic about this. He was really excited to have captured his very own barbarian chieftain. Claudius was very proud of having conquered Britain. He named his only child and son Britannicus to really try and link himself forever with the conquest of this island. So he had Caratacus brought to Rome so he could show him off. So Caratacus, this British chieftain, was brought to the shining city of Rome, a city of marble on 7 hills. He saw the dome of the Pantheon. He saw the forums. He saw the Palatine Hill. Things well beyond anything he'd ever imagined before. And he turned to the emperor and he said, "Why is it that you, who has all of this, ever envied what little we had in Britain?" Which goes to show the Britons did not build cities. They didn't really build in stone. They didn't build like the Romans do. The Romans did. The Romans built towns, they built forts, and they built roads. They built nice, straight, well-constructed roads. Why did they build roads? They built roads so that their armies could get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. This was important in Britannia because Britannia was a highly militarized province. There were always, throughout the whole 350 years of Roman occupation, a lot of soldiers here. To really kind of show this point, there were at any time during the Roman occupation, there was anywhere between 3 and 5 times as many soldiers in what is today just England and Wales than there was in the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula. That's Spain and Portugal. When you think of the size of Spain compared to England, 5 times as many soldiers here, that's a lot of soldiers. And this is a very rough map that I drew myself on the Microsoft Paint app, showing the roads and forts that the Romans built. They built towns for people to live in, forts to protect the towns, roads to connect the forts. And what this can tell us is that Elmbridge, or the area that would one day become Elmbridge, was pretty far off the beaten track. There were no roads built through this area. There are roads kind of nearby. There's one that runs north of the Thames and crosses it somewhere near Staines or Guildford, but none through Elmbridge. It's the same with towns and forts. Towns and forts popped up all around the country. None in Elmbridge. There doesn't seem to have been any need. This wasn't unusual. The Roman Empire was an empire of cities, but it was an empire of cities in a time when 90% of the population lived in the countryside. So the people who lived here, the Celtic Britons, after the Romans invaded, seem to have, for generations, continued living roughly the same way that they had for generations beforehand. Roman culture disseminated slowly over time outside of the urban areas. It wasn't until 300 years after the initial Roman invasion that a substantial Roman construction began in Elmbridge. In 1942, in Chatley Farm in Cobham, what is today Cobham, a bathhouse, a Roman bathhouse, was excavated. Since then, 4 rooms to this bathhouse have been found. It's almost certain that there was a villa attached to it as well, but that villa has since disappeared. It was probably washed away by the changing course of the River Mole. And bathing was an incredibly Roman thing. This is very much a sign of Roman culture disseminating outwards. The Romans bathed. That was part of their thing. Now, I have to clarify. Everyone throughout history has washed. It's not that only the Romans washed. But bathing is a leisure activity. Roman baths, like this one here in the city of Bath in Somerset, were huge leisure complexes. They had gymnasiums. They had massage parlors. They had bars. Bathing was something you did to socialize. People would meet friends at baths. It was where people discussed business. It had very little to do with personal hygiene. In fact, if some Roman authors are to be believed, you would probably leave the bath dirtier than you were when you got in it, because there was no chlorine in that pool. Everything that washed off of the hundreds of people that might use it in a day stayed in that stagnant water. It was common knowledge, common sense really to the Romans that you did not go to the public baths if you had a cut, because they knew you'd probably leave with an infection. They knew that. So this is a sign of either Romans moving to the local area and trying to keep some home comforts with them, or local Britons aspiring to be more Roman. Either way, they didn't do a very good job. The Chatley farmhouse, the Chatley farm bathhouse is a engineering nightmare. I said beforehand the Romans were great builders. This is not a great example of it. It's basically rubble with a paddling pool in the middle. It was very poorly constructed and probably a nightmare to maintain, because within 4 decades of its completion of construction finishing, it had fallen completely out of use. No one was using it anymore, so they probably couldn't really keep it running. Nevertheless, it's a sign. The Romans also brought, as well as their bathing culture, their cuisine. One of the best examples of this is wine drinking, something many people still do today. The Britons, before the Romans came, had no wine. It was stronger than any type of alcohol that they could make themselves. So initially, they were very suspicious of it. They thought that, oh no, we can't start drinking this, society will collapse. But it didn't take long before they were converted and they were drinking wine just like the rest of the empire. Also in foods, a good deal of herbs, vegetables and plants that nowadays we consider staples of English gardens and allotments aren't native to this island. They were brought over by the Romans. Things like onions, asparagus, rosemary. Rhubarb is an interesting one. Rhubarb is thought to have come, it's debated where it comes from, but the Romans thought it came from Russia, and so they called it barbarian rah, which is where we still get our word rhubarb today. Interesting, isn't it? Now, this food was brought not just by the Romans, the Roman emperors, it was brought from people by people all around their massive empire. This is the Roman Empire at its territorial height under the Emperor Trajan. As you can see, it stretches from Spain through a lot of Europe, North Africa, a good deal of the Middle East, and that's us right up there at the top. Now, many of the people who brought their cuisines and their cultures and their various other aspects to Britain were the soldiers. Soldiers rotated, especially in the early empire, all round the frontiers. And most Roman soldiers were not Romans. They were auxiliaries. And this was even more so the case in Britain. By far the majority of the guys in the British military camps were auxiliary soldiers who were subject peoples, people who had been conquered by the Romans, who now fought on their behalf for pay, for citizenship, or for really good pensions. Initially, in 43 CE, the spearhead of the invasion was led by Batavians, people who come from the Low Countries, modern-day Netherlands and Belgium. They were the guys who the Romans sent in the first wave. But as time went on, more people from all around the empire came here until Britain became a fairly multi-ethnic place. So lots of Syrians came over in the first few generations, and we know this because they left graffiti in their native language and tombstones in their native language. Lots of North Africans and lots of Illyrians. Illyria is around here, the former Yugoslavian countries. Highly militarized area, lots of Illyrians ended up in Britain. One particularly famous one, a guy called Constantine, ended up becoming emperor in Britain. So these people brought with them not only their cuisines and cultures, but also their gods. Lots of gods from all around the world ended up being worshipped in Britain. A good example is Mithra, part of Mithraism. Now, there are, as far as I know, 3 Mithraic temples in Britain, one famous one in London, one in Wales, and one up by Hadrian's Wall. Mithra as a god has his origins in India, and he is ancient. He's over 3,000 years old. In India, he was a god in the north of India. He was a god related to, like, official friendship and partnership. Around 500 years later, the Iranians, bordering with the Indians, learnt to worship this god as well. But Mithra to them was a solar deity associated with the sun. And then clearly, a few hundred years later, some Roman legionaries stationed on the Syrian border met some Iranians and some Persians, learned about this god, started worshipping him themselves, and when they were stationed in Britain, they brought Mithra with them. That's why there is a Mithraic temple in London to this day. It's nearly 2,000 years old. You can still visit it now. The Romans were very happy to let this stuff happen. They weren't snobs about their religion. It wasn't an exclusive religion. They were very, very happy to accept foreign gods into their pantheon, or regularly to see other people's gods and other people's religious practices as merely different expressions of their own faith. So a good example there on the far left, that is from Bath. That's from a temple to Sulis Minerva. Sulis is an ancient British god. She was worshipped here long before the Romans came. And clearly the Romans saw her and equated her with their goddess of wisdom, Minerva. That's Athena, if anyone here is more familiar with Greek mythology. But they were also happy to just start worshipping foreign gods outright, as was the case with Isis, an Egyptian goddess, and Cybele, who was an Anatolian goddess from modern-day Turkey. And this was kind of how the Romans did things. They didn't turn up in 43 CE, determined to dress everyone on this island in a toga and teach them Latin. That's not how they did empire. They let their culture mostly disseminate out organically. And provided that you paid your taxes and behaved yourself, they were generally happy to let their subject peoples continue to speak their own language, practice their own culture, and worship their own gods. With one very important exception. Well, with several exceptions, but one extreme exception here in Britain. There was a part of British religious life that the Romans absolutely did not tolerate and put a lot of effort into stamping out. And that is the importance of the Druids. Druids are a mysterious lot. They were clearly a religious caste to the Celtic Britons, very thought to be connected with the gods of this land. They are also thought by some to have been like a legal class. So in a pre-literate society, a society without writing, people would memorize the law, the traditions, the ways of doing things. And then if ever there was a dispute, you would go to the Druid, and the Druid would act as like judge. It's also possible that they were medical practitioners to some degree or another, but we really don't know. They're very mysterious to us, and one of the reasons we don't know is all we know about them was written by their mortal enemies, the Romans. The Romans hated the Druids. They outlawed them immediately. And the reason they hated the Druids, so they told everyone, is that the Druids were performing human sacrifice. Ooh. So Julius Caesar, in his commentaries, talks about the Brythonic Druids, and he says that he saw them sacrifice someone using a wicker man. Anyone who's seen the classic British 1973 horror movie starring the late, great Christopher Lee knows exactly what that means. And if you haven't, spoiler alert, they burned someone. That's how it works. Diodorus Siculus, who was a Greek writer living in Sicily about 50 years before Caesar's invasion, he also talks about one of these sacrifices, and his description is more gruesome. He said the Druids would find their victim, they would hold him down, and while he was still living, they would take a knife and cut open his torso. And by the convulsion and movement of his organs as he died, they would predict the future. I know, nasty, hey? Maybe. There is some archaeological evidence to suggest that in Central and Northern European cultures at this time, human sacrifice was practiced, but it's far from conclusive. Historians are divided very much on the topic of whether or not the Celtic Britons did perform human sacrifices, and if so, how often? Was it a weekly thing? Did they all go down to the village square, find some poor sod that no one liked and cut him open? Or was it saved for dire circumstances? Was it only during times of famine or pestilence when they thought, right, desperate measures, we got to get the gods back on side? Human sacrifice or no, the Druids had to go. That was the motto of the Romans. They were determined to wipe them out. So they started an 18-year-long campaign of eradication that completely drove the Druids out of this part of Britain. This was the first to be, for this process to go through, the first part of Britain for this process to start. Eventually, the Druids were driven all the way west into Wales, where they made a final last stand on their sacred island of Mona, which is modern-day Isle of Anglesey, up by the northwest coast of Wales. It didn't work, though. The Romans burnt the island down and everything on it, and they massacred the entire population. That was how the Romans did war, all of the time. They did it brutally, totally, and by modern standards, genocidally. There's a Roman author from the 1st century called Tacitus. He wrote a biography of his father-in-law, with whom he was very close. And his father-in-law had been a governor of Britain. And he said of the Romans, or he put words in the mouth of a British chieftain saying of the Romans that they create a desert and they call that peace. Just in case any of you have any romanticized ideas of the Romans as bringers of civilization and things like that. Regardless, Roman rule on this island was not destined to last. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was in a bad way, and Britain started to feel neglected. Britain had never been a #1 priority province. It was on the very periphery of the empire. It was not economically important. And so the Britons felt neglected as Rome started to deal with its own internal problems. And they dealt with this by rebelling. But they didn't rebel for independence. No one wanted that. They rebelled to be more included in the imperial system. And the way they did this is they found powerful military men to raise up as usurper emperors. They said, if the emperor's not going to listen to our demands, we'll replace him with one of our guys. But the Romano-British at this time were pretty fickle. We make fun nowadays of ex-Prime Minister Liz Truss for not outlasting a lettuce in her premiership. These guys that the Celtic Britons raised up wouldn't have outlasted the amount of time it takes for a cup of tea to reach room temperature. The Romano-British killed them as quickly as they raised them up. But eventually they got lucky. They found a man that everyone could get behind, a man called Constantine III. Constantine III was one of the many generals of the British legions, and he made big promises. He told everyone he was going to go to Rome, assume power, easily and quickly fix all of the empire's problems, and then he'd return to Britain, and they'd all work together to make it a land of milk and honey. And everyone waved him off as he took all the legions in Britain, put them on boats, and took them to the continent to fulfill his destiny. That's the end of Roman Britain. No one at the time knew it. There was no official break. It wasn't like Brexit. We didn't sign a piece of paper and that's it, you're out. No one got a new passport. For decades, the people who lived here considered themselves part of the Roman Empire, and the Romans still considered Britannia their province. But there were no legions here. The emperor's sway meant nothing here. Britain was starting to drift away. Now, various barbarian peoples, people from what is today Scotland and northern continental Europe, saw Britain, a rich Roman province that had been disarmed for 3.5 centuries now. They saw a place that the legions were no longer protecting, and they took advantage. They attacked and they started raiding and pillaging it. And the Romans sent a message to the emperor at the time saying, "Hi, it's us, your incredibly loyal subjects. Please send even just a small army to protect our island from these ongoing raids." And they got, in response, basically the ancient version of an auto-generated response email. The emperor thanked them for their ongoing support, but unfortunately, due to the invasion of Attila the Hun, he is unable to provide aid at this time. Look to yourselves. That's the exact wording of it. The emperor said, look to yourselves. And that was a lesson that eventually the Romano-British took to heart. With these raids increasing, they wrote to a tribe called the Angles, a North Germanic tribe, asking them for help, asking to hire them like mercenaries to come and protect Britain. Spoiler alert, Angle, the name of this tribe, is the root of our word England, in case you're wondering how these people ended up becoming relevant. They, according to legend, invited 2 brothers over, Hengist and Horsa. And Hengist and Horsa fought alongside the Britons. They defeated the various pirates and raiders that were assailing the island, and then they refused to go home. Instead, they wrote back to their tribe, the Angles, and said, "Hey guys, we're in this incredibly rich ex-Roman province. The people here are useless. The Romans have been fighting their battles for 350 years. I reckon if you get in your longboats with enough spears and axes, we'll run this whole island in no time." And that's exactly what happened. So according to legend, Horsa was killed in battle, but Hengist made himself the first king of Kent, the first king of the Anglo-Saxon era. It's worth noting, this is from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This story wasn't written down for hundreds of years after the event, and many historians reckon it's more like a myth than real history. But it's certainly based on real history. At this time, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes made their way over. And they would have an enormous impact on both Britain and Elmbridge specifically. And one of the clearest impacts they had was a linguistic one. The people who lived here before, the Celtic Britons, spoke a Celtic language, a Brittonic language related distantly to modern-day Welsh and Cornish. The Romans had spoken Latin and sometimes Greek. The Anglo-Saxons spoke a West Germanic language. It sounds like this. This is an excerpt from an Anglo-Saxon epic poem called The Wanderer. It's about a lonely exile reminiscing on better times. Where cum merg, where cum margo, where cum mathumgifa? Where now is the horse, where now its rider, where is the giver of gold? That is the root of our modern English language. Now, obviously, it's quite different. No one would understand me today if I went up to someone in the street and said, excuse me, where cum Meg, where cum Margot? They wouldn't know what I was talking about. But if you look carefully, you can see the beginnings of the roots of modern English. This word here, for example, where, is just where, but the H and the W have been switched round. That's because of the French. When the Normans came over, they couldn't pronounce the Anglo-Saxon where, so they switched the W and H, and that's what we still use today. These last two syllables, gifa, giver, it is to give. You can see the beginnings of English coming in. And of course, the word our country, England, Angleland, comes from the Angles. For Elmbridge specifically, oh yes, and of course, many of our county names are Anglo-Saxon. Anything ending in sex, Essex, Sussex, etc., East Saxon, South Saxon, Middle Saxon. Surrey, where we live, South Way. Not very inventive with names, the Anglo-Saxons. They were very straightforward, to-the-point people, and I respect them for that. Now, regarding Elmbridge itself, Elmbridge is an Anglo-Saxon name. It was the Anglo-Saxon name for this area. It comes from Elbridge. That's how it's spelt in the Domesday book. And that means the bridge over the river Elm. Elm means misty, so it means the misty river or the river of mist. It has nothing to do with elm trees, a fact clearly misunderstood by whoever in 1972 designed our coat of arms and very creatively put an elm tree on a bridge. I wonder what that's meant to mean. No, it means bridge over the misty river, the River Elm, which sometime around the 16th century people started calling the River Mole instead, and that's the Mole River to this day. Now, we call Elmbridge a borough. A borough is a modern administrative district. It also comes from an Anglo-Saxon word, burr. Burr's the word. Burr's the, yeah, no, it's good, isn't it? Do you guys want to say burr with me? Burr. Feels good, doesn't it? Burr. Nice word. It means, yeah, like Edinburgh. It means a fortified town. You can see its cousin words in Dutch and German. Burg has the same meaning. But a burr or borough is not how the Anglo-Saxons referred to their administrative districts. They'd have called it 100. Now, what does 100 mean? You all know what 100 means. It's a number, 100, that's 100. But 100 what? So the leading theory is that a Saxon 100 meant somewhere an area of land capable of sustaining 100 families, 100 hides. That's the leading theory, but it's not the only one. Some people say it might also be an area from which 100 soldiers can be drawn when they conscripted men into their armies. Either way, this is when Elmbridge, the word, enters history as an administrative district around here. And it was also a little smaller than it is today. Lots of places now in Elmbridge weren't in Elmbridge at the time. I'm going to throw a couple of other Anglo-Saxon sounds at you now. Ham and ton. Now, if we put some other funny-sounding Anglo-Saxon sounds in front of them, we have the names of many towns and villages here in Elmbridge. Hersham, for example, first recorded in the 13th century as Havericham, the home of someone called Haverich, presumably a very important man if they named the village after him. Who knows, in 1,000 years, maybe we'll call this place Julie Andrewsham, depending on the cultural staying power of the sound of music. There's another one, Cobham, first mentioned in the Domesday Book as well. Home or dwelling of cover or coffer, another big shot. Now, I should mention that almost all of these etymologies are to some degree or another disputed. Historians and linguists don't always agree. Ham, for example, is most commonly translated, and that's what I've used here, as home or dwelling. But it can also mean the bend in a river, like Fulham is a bend in a river. It can also mean an area of dry land surrounded by marsh. So there's a little bit of leeway, a little bit of wiggle room with these translations, but there is one place name in this local area which isn't very controversial. We pretty much know what it means. Walton, coming from the ton, town, and the word velas, which in Anglo-Saxon means foreigner or stranger, town of the strangers or town of the foreigners. You might also recognize velas as the root of our word Welsh. The Welsh don't call themselves Welsh, they call themselves, I think, Cymru is, I think, how it's pronounced. Sorry to any Welsh speakers in here if I mispronounce that. But Welsh is an Anglo-Saxon word that they used to describe the people who lived here when they arrived, the Celtic Britons. Welsh means foreigner or stranger. It can also be translated as slave, because when the Saxons captured someone in battle, they would enslave them. They would either keep them for themselves, or personally, I think more likely, they took them to the continent or all the way to the Near East to sell them on the great slave markets of the larger empires. Now, all this suggests what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us, which is that the first generation of migrators who came over from northern Germany lived in a state of more or less constant violence with the locals, eventually driving them to what we today call the Celtic Fringe, Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland and Scotland up north. And this might make you think that the Anglo-Saxons were a bunch of thugs and a really nasty bunch who came over here and just started stealing everything, and they were. But don't worry, they're about to get a taste of their own medicine. So, in the late 8th century, I'm not that satisfied by it, but you know, you can't help but read this history and think, oh, I wish someone would come and put an axe in one of these guys, and then before you know it, in the late 8th century, raiders from Scandinavia, people we today call Vikings, but were at the time called Norse or Northmen, started raiding the coast of England. Initially, it was only small raids, nothing for the people in Elmbridge to worry about. We're nice and far inland. And, you know, they'd attack small bits of the coast, 2 or 3 ships would turn up, they'd axe a few fellas, they'd take as much as they could, and they'd be on their way home. But in 865, that all changed. In 865, a huge invasion force known as the Great Heathen Army arrived in England, and they began rapidly conquering the place. By the year 871, they'd conquered much of the northeast of England, and this gave them the confidence to start raiding deeper into England than they ever had before. This is when our little corner, Elmbridge, started falling victim. The first Viking raid to head this far up the Thames took place in 871 and resulted in the sacking of Chertsey Abbey. Luckily, later that year, a king of Wessex, a fellow called Alfred, often called Alfred the Great, defeated the Vikings and made a deal with them. They divided England in two. The Vikings would continue to rule in the northeast, in something called the Danelaw, and in the southwest, Wessex and the Anglo-Saxons would hold sway. But this fragile peace did not last. Soon the Vikings were up to their old tricks. In 933, a Viking chieftain called Anlaf, as part of his campaign to prove to everyone why he should be King of York, sailed up the Thames again and razed Walton-on-Thames. He sacked it and burned it to the ground. Nearly a full century later, a king of Denmark called Canute the Great, as part of his soon-to-be successful campaign for why he should be King of England, did the exact same thing. Now, he left Walton-on-Thames alone, but this is likely because of the depressing fact that Walton still hadn't been rebuilt since the last time it was burned down, and he destroyed the town that was at Coway, where Caesar's stakes supposedly were, proving that those stakes were equally inefficient in repelling Vikings as they had been in repelling Romans. Someone should really have a word with who put them there. And eventually, both the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, both of their eras in England, would come to an end. At the same time, in 1066, when a nasty brute called William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, came over here and conquered the place. Since then, we've known him very appropriately as William the Conqueror, or William I of England. Now, I'd love to stay here and talk more about the various ways in which the Norman conquest shaped England and the local area, but I think I'm running out of time and the scope of this talk, so we're just going to cover their biggest achievement, the Domesday Book. Now, the Domesday Book sounds incredibly cool. It's a great title. It's not. It's really, really dull. It's just a survey. It's just a list of names and places. It was written by William the Conqueror so he could more efficiently tax the people of his new realm. He made big lists of all the people who lived and the amount of wealth generated by various towns. And although this is very dull, it does give us an insight into some details about what Walton and Hersham and Cobham and the local area was like at the time, how many people lived here and what they lived off of. So we know that Weybridge was a fairly small village, only 7 households, none of which were particularly profitable. Walton, on the other hand, had 31 households. That puts it in the top 30% regarding size of towns in England. It had its own mill, had its own parish church, it had its own fishery, and it had woodland dedicated for use. So it was a relatively well-off area. What this shows us is scale. In the 2011 census, just under 23,000 people resided in Walton-on-Thames. If that had been the case in 1086 when the Domesday Book was written, that would have made it by a country mile the largest city in England, with over twice the population of the next largest city, London, which had just over 10,000 people living in it at the time. This shows us what has been the case throughout this whole talk, and which I've wanted to touch on, and slide this fact in there, that we've been dealing with a rural people living off the land, mostly just subsistence farming, and not thinking about the greater historical narratives that they were a part of. Nevertheless, it was from these few households, these few dozen families, who were farming the land and fishing the river, that the roots of Elmbridge grew into the place that we know today. Ancient Elmbridge is now lost to memory, forever gone. Only fragments of it remain, the little bits of evidence, some of which I've shown you in this presentation, from which we can create a reflection of an incomplete puzzle, which is almost a picture of what life was like back then. But through that incomplete puzzle, we can feel a very slight and tenuous human connection to people who are now long dead and whose way of life is long dead. And that, to me, is the great beauty of studying history, and it's a beauty that I've been very happy to share with you guys today. Thank you all very much. Does anybody have any questions?